Welcome back. We are on episode 2 of our new series, Discovering the Gospel of Luke. And just as a way of giving some introduction to the series, I was really trying to come up with a way to help us understand why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I found these 2 little videos by John Mark Comer, who is the author of the book that we used for one of our series last year. And he talks about the 6 influences of how we become who we are.
Right.
And just quickly, they are habits, which is our routines, how we spend our time. 2, our relationships, who we spend our time with.
Yep.
Your mom always told you become like your friends or whatever. The stories we tell ourselves, so that's how we process what we believe. So stories help us make sense of the world, and that's why we enjoy movies and books, and it's actually how advertising works.
Sure.
Because they try and tell us a story. Your life will be better if you drive our car.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
look how wonderful.
Oh man, I wish I could remember what it was. Now that I said it, there was some commercial I was watching this week which told some absolutely wonderful story, and at the end they tack on what they're selling, and I'm like, that doesn't even fit the story.
No, and they're always driving on a nice lush green forest,
or driving on a boat with
never snow.
Well, exactly. Very lush. The next one is the environment. That's where we live sort of geographically, or maybe our birth family. Those would fit into, it's not necessarily the specific environment, but and those are sort of the 4 elements of the things that we do. But there's also what happens to us. So there's time.
Right.
So over time, particularly habits can have a cumulative effect.
Sure.
So it's hard to break a habit. And 2, experience. So there's different major life changes that can have a huge effect on who we become. So it could be a marriage, the death of a family member, moving to a different city or country, sickness, all of those things. So John Mark Comer says that these things are all part of us, and even if we don't think about it, so we're not intentional about becoming something specific, we still become who we are because of these influences.
Right.
And he made mention that this comes from science and psychology and I forget the other discipline, where they disagree on the degree of what's the most influential.
Right. Okay.
But they all agree that those things
are influential.
Influential themselves. So the good news that he said was that is that we can be intentional about the things we do. So 1, we can cultivate new habits to replace ones we don't like doom scrolling. We can choose who we spend our time with. We can choose to listen to different stories. This one's a little more vague, and it probably only means something to followers of Jesus, but he suggests that as followers of Jesus, because we have the Holy Spirit in us, that is an influence on our environment, because now we're relying on God's Spirit to influence our actions.
Right.
And then, so I kind of, and there's actually 2 little videos that his team put together, and I will link those in the show notes. So to kick off the new year, we wanted to start off with a Bible study.
Yep.
So we're going to, but I thought it's not just Bible study, it's focusing on doing Bible study and praying together in community.
Yeah.
Both in our Sunday services, in our home groups. And why I really like this, because it hits several of the influences of who we become. And our goal as followers of Jesus is to become more like Jesus. So reading scripture and praying are practices that can become habits. Doing it with other followers of Jesus is choosing who we spend more time with. Reading the Bible actually helps shape our beliefs and stories to help us make sense of the world. And finally, just simply asking the Holy Spirit to guide us as we read hits the environment influence, which again helps us become more mature in our faith. And we spent some time last year in 2 different series, Thriving in Community and Spiritual Practices, where we learned the different things that help us or cause maturity in our faith. So this is, I see it as more of an extension of those things.
Sure.
In that we learned about them, and this is a way to put it into practice. So I thought that to me made sense as sort of an introduction of why we're doing what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So this past Sunday we looked at Luke chapter 1. Today we're going to jump in and look at Luke chapter 2.
All right, and so just in this series, just so everyone is kind of aware of what we're doing, is every week we're going to cover 2 chapters.
Yep.
There's some weeks it will be just a single chapter.
Yep.
And we'll make sure people are aware of that. And the reason that is just you got a week, you can read it slowly, you can read it again a couple times,
Yep.
and then on a Sunday or through this podcast video, we'll just take that little bit of time to just talk about a portion of it. And then what we're hoping in this is we're instead of like kind of what normally we do is sort of like we present the whole thing.
Yep.
We're going to strategically not necessarily have a lot of our own rhetoric on certain things, but hopefully pose it to you in discussion with, whether it's just thoughts or discussion with a friend,
Yep.
hopefully discussion in your small groups to just take it further in what some of this stuff is.
Yep.
And so, we're going to walk through a little bit of chapter 2.
So our job here is we're going to provide some context, maybe some things you wouldn't know just from reading the portion of scripture, and hopefully that may help you better understand what you're reading.
Yeah.
But again, the whole goal is to, we're sort of crafting some questions, which we'll get to in the end, that will just help us discover, or help you as a person discover what we're reading and what it means. So
Perfect. All right. So Luke covers the early life of Jesus, basically in chapter 2.
Yep.
And of the 4 Gospels, it is the most exhaustive coverage of his early life.
Yeah.
And it's still not that much. It's 1 chapter.
Yep.
We start chapter 2 with the birth, and chapter 3 starts, he's an adult. Mark hits the ground running in his gospel. John establishes divine origin and nature, but then hits the ground running.
Yep.
Matthew lets us know he was born.
Yeah.
That's the end of that story.
Yeah.
We hear that the Magi meet Jesus as a child.
Yeah.
The whole family flee to Egypt because of Herod, and eventually return. And we're not going to get into that. You can look at Matthew chapter 2 for that if you want to look into that yourself. But that's it. It's Luke who covers more of, again, his childhood, which again is not much, but it's the most comprehensive that we have in the Gospels.
Yeah, and that's the traditional Christmas story, which we've just come back by Christmas, where we read Luke 2, 1 to 20.
Yep.
That's literally 20 verses.
20 verses.
Cover the sort of Christmas story.
And then we move to the dedication and circumcision when he's 8 months old. And
8 days old.
8 days old, sorry. 8 days old. And there's a prophecy there by a man named Simeon. There's a prophecy by a woman named Anna.
Yep.
And then we're kind of at the end of the book. And so we've gotten to the birth, infancy.
Yeah.
We've gotten 8 days later. And then at the end here of sort of chapter 2, he's 12. That's what 12 he's 12 years old.
Yeah. So there's a little gap in there.
There's a little gap in there. So it's kind of what we have. Now, in the Jewish culture, Jesus is a year away from what is called accountability.
Your bar mitzvah,
Well, and a bar mitzvah wouldn't have been happening yet. That happens 500 some years later. But there's that age of accountability. They're responsible for their actions at kind of 13.
Yep.
And so apparently when they're 12, instruction actually becomes a way more intensive in preparation for adulthood.
Yep.
So this is an important transition point, which is probably why Luke has it.
Many kids after age 13, some would go on to study to become rabbis or priests.
Absolutely. Or just more into the actual family job or whatever it is that's going on to. At this point, it's kind of like they're no longer, so much children at that point.
Yeah, you're really
kind of in
picking
adulthood.
your vocation. Yeah.
And so this is probably why Luke included it. It's an important transition point. Again, we don't know anything in between there.
Yeah.
So as we read it, we might want to ask ourselves, what does Luke want us to know about Jesus in this specific moment?
As a child.
Yeah.
Because really, this is the only story about Jesus as a child.
This is the only story we have. So what are some of the reasons he might have included this story?
Yeah.
So you can read along. We're going to be reading in the New Living Translation, or you can just listen as we read through it. But feel free to do whatever works for you, whatever works better. But here we are. We're in chapter 2. We're going to start with verse 39. There, he's talking about Galilee in Nazareth. There, the child grew up healthy and strong, He was filled with wisdom, and God's favor was on him. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When Jesus was 12 years old, they attended the festival as usual. After the celebration was over, they started home to Nazareth, but Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't miss him at first because they assumed he was among the other travelers. But when he didn't show up that evening, they started looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they couldn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem to search for him there. 3 days later, they finally discovered him in the temple, sitting among the religious leaders, listening to them and asking questions. All who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. His parents didn't know what to think. "Son," his mother said to him, "why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been frantic, searching for you everywhere." "But why did you need to search?" he asked. "Didn't you know that I must be in my father's house?" But they didn't understand what he meant. Then he returned to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. And his mother stored all these things in her heart. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and all the people. So we have Jesus, Mary, and Joseph.
Yep.
They're traveling from Nazareth to Jerusalem.
Yep.
And they traveled very likely in a very large caravan. Yeah. Family, other people from the community, and this would have been especially the Passover would have been a big traveling point. It was encouraged for everyone to go.
There's a lot of people to go.
Yeah. And this is why they probably didn't necessarily notice Jesus was not there at first.
Because it sounds like they're negligent parents.
It does.
Right?
It really does. They're not in the family station wagon going away. There's probably many people, and again, like being a big community and family that would have been there, they would just assume like, oh, yep, we saw him kind of before we left. He's with his cousins, his friends, somewhere in the midst of all of us.
He knew we were leaving.
Yep. And then the travel was approximately 3 days to Jerusalem from Nazareth. So they get to that first night.
And they're walking.
And with lots of things. So there's probably with a big group there, I would think that, and this is just my speculation, that depending upon, who's all there, you're going as fast as your slowest person.
Yep.
So, exactly. Not everyone's probably speed walking. There's probably some older people, younger people, kids playing. You're trying to be good because a lot of that is it can be unsafe in that travel.
Exactly. If you're not in a group,
big group, you're a little safer. Anyway, so that's again. But what I want us to notice in the story is repetition, and it's really actually very important when we're reading any sort of thing in the Bible. Is when we notice repetition, whether it's direct, like again they repeat themselves more directly, or kind of paraphrase things, that way. If it's repeated, it means the author is trying to make some kind of emphasis.
Yeah, he's trying to make you take note of something.
Exactly. And there's repetition at both ends of this story.
Yeah.
When we kind of open this, Luke writes how Jesus is growing in wisdom as well as God's favor. At the end of the story, he talks about how he's growing in wisdom and in God's favor. So these are really, really important to take note moment. We kind of see it in the idea of the modern day origin story, like with our superheroes.
Yeah.
We usually tell the story and there's something important that's telling us about the character in that.
Sure.
It was actually really very normal in ancient writings to do that. Tell a childhood story or stories that speak of who they will become. And we can see that in evidences about, say, Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
Stories that highlighted certain attributes.
Yeah.
And those authors were really, again, saw that as important as that moment of like, oh, look, we saw that happening right here. And in adulthood, more of that happening. We probably see that in modern day biographies too. Probably some of the stories that, we'll read in childhood of whoever we're reading about are probably fairly strategic in why those stories were there, because it's to show this growth or character that's flowing through there. So with Jesus, Luke is letting us know that he's wise and he's growing in wisdom.
Yeah.
So we might ask ourselves, why not something more fantastical?
Yeah.
We read that in John that he's turned water into wine. We read that he heals the blind and raises the dead. Yet Luke speaks of Jesus growing in wisdom at the beginning. In the midst of the story, he demonstrates it by some of the responses of those who were with Jesus in the temple, and then at the end, repeats himself again.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that, because I've actually talked to people who thought that maybe Jesus did do miracles as a child.
There is some thoughts about
and
that.
Two, even into adulthood, he was around 30 years old when he started his public ministry.
Yeah.
What did he do before then?
Yeah.
Well, we know that he worked in some sort of construction, either carpentry or stonemasonry or just general construction, incorporating both of those. So he was a blue-collar worker.
Yeah, essentially.
He was obviously, it's interesting that he has the favor of God and people, because we see that even when Jesus starts his ministry, that people generally like him.
Yeah.
That even people who are not known to be religious people like to be with Jesus and eat with him. So there's that favor of God on him that gives him favor with people. So I think that we can see even from the earliest childhood here. And that we don't know if there was miracles or anything else, but there isn't any mention of it. So it likely isn't a factor at this stage of his life.
No, it doesn't. Enough where Luke doesn't seem to think it's necessary to talk about, but this one seems he needs to say.
Yeah, which is really interesting.
So it is important to know, because as we read on, we are through Luke, we're probably going to notice and witness Jesus' wisdom.
Yeah.
So here's a question, really important as we're reading through stuff like that. What kind of questions can come to our mind, and then trying to answer them. So here's a question we might ask, especially with the idea of Luke. Why might Luke want us to know that an important virtue of Jesus is wisdom?
Mm-hmm.
And then, as we sort of maybe take some time to think through that, you might want to just sort of add this idea: what is a story that shows Jesus' wisdom that's been impactful or memorable to you?
Mm-hmm.
So right there, why might that be important? And we're going to leave that with you. You just take some time of just like, why might have Luke saw this really important to tell this story that points so much to Jesus being wise, especially even noticeable right before that cusp of adulthood.
Yeah. And then there's some parts where Jesus shows extraordinary wisdom that we read of once he started his ministry. And boy, I really want to tell one right now, but I'll refrain, because I think it's important for us to, like you said, to think through some of the things that we've read about Jesus and how maybe some of his answers were very wise, and how that he actually started when he was a child. So.
And it might be just something in as for any of us to do as we're remembering this sort of stuff, is just like maybe we'll come up with the story right away, but maybe as we read on Luke over these next little while, is to, as you come to that story, we're like, hey, this is that wisdom thing. Mark it down somehow, whether you highlight it on your YouVersion app, or if you're like paper, you can use a highlighter for that. Something to mark it down.
Yeah.
Like, hey, there's a demonstration of wisdom that was really neat, that really impacted me.
Mm.
Another thing we want to note in this whole story is Jesus' response to Mary when she says, "We've been looking for you everywhere."
Yeah.
Because verse 49 says, "But why did you need to search?" He asked.
Yeah.
"Didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house?"
Obviously not.
Well, and this is kind of interesting here. Luke writes that Mary and Joseph didn't understand what he meant by that. That's a great question for us, and that's going to lead us to this next question.
Yeah.
What might we think Jesus meant in verse 49? It's good to take some time to speculate. Okay, he's saying that. And what's really great, and I encourage, this is your bent, go look at a few commentaries, because I'll tell you right, there's some different thoughts.
Yeah.
There's some commentaries where like, hey, there's a lot of speculation on this, and there's some, they'll have 3 or 4 thoughts or ideas. Yeah. So definitely spend some time to just think, hey, what might Jesus have meant that even kind of stumped his parents in that moment? So take a moment, do some discussion. We're not going to even speculate ourselves here again on that. We're going to leave that for you. But what we want to bring us back to is just sort of like the setup of practice as we read through Luke. And that's applying this general question. Now, we have sort of used this kind of question before as we've talked about this. And this is essentially saying, what is this saying about Jesus? What in this portion of Luke is Luke trying to say about Jesus? Yeah. What is it telling us? So if we look at verse 49, and let's read that again. But why did you need to search? He asked. Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house? Mm-hmm. So we're not even going to take that time again. We're leaving that to you. What did he mean? But what is something that we can glean from this as what's something telling us about Jesus here? Mm-hmm. And for me, in this, I don't know to what degree. I don't even know how. But Jesus seems to have kind of some sort of awareness of who he is, what he's supposed to do, and obviously his connection to God. And I think that's kind of a wild thing to think that, because I think I've heard that said before. When did Jesus find out? When did he know all this stuff? Obviously the stuff we even heard, as we read through the Christmas story. That is a question people quite often pose. Yeah. And at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily answer that question. All I can sit there is it seems that Luke might have, some of the reasons included this was, again, I don't know what the degree or exactly how, but by this time in his life, he seemed to have some understanding of what he was supposed to do and his connection to God.
And who he was, yeah. Which is, just thought popped into my mind, is that his parents were supposed to know who he was.
Yeah.
They had both been visited by angels.
Yep.
Who told them who he was. Yep. But now 12 years later, he seemed like and again, I'm just surmising this, like such an ordinary kid that this surprised them.
Yeah.
And that they couldn't actually figure out his response.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it's I think last week I talked about the same idea when Zechariah is in the temple and he gets visited by an angel, and he gets a message from God, from an angel, that he's going to have a son. He's like, I can't have a son. I'm too old. So it's like, it's like, even though you have this miraculous thing happen, it's still hard for us to come to grips with what it actually means.
Well, and I think there can be a certain amount of maybe, I'm going to say reassurance for us, because I think sometimes, I know I've felt this way, and maybe you have too, where you just wish you had that thing from God, word from God to that for life or something like that. And here we have stories of they did. And it seems that, like there was some difficulty in that. Yeah. Doubt in that. Yeah. Or as you said, as you just sort of mentioned with Mary and Joseph, they had that visitation of an angel, and yet when Jesus is basically saying, I got it, I figured it. I think at least I'm starting to figure this out. They're like, I don't really understand what's going on here. Yeah. And so sometimes that reassurance that we need, it still says, well, we might kind of forget or, hey, need more reassurance or stuff like that. So I think that's an important thing. Luke is sharing this revelation, this idea that Jesus seems to have some sort of understanding at age 12 of who he is and his connection to God. Mm-hmm. This is actually the first time Jesus speaks in Luke.
Yep.
And it's just, again, pointing to that he seems to have some sort of understanding. And what I really like that it continues on is right after that, after Jesus shares that with his parents, it says that Luke writes that he went with his parents and that he was obedient to them. Mm-hmm. And that might lead me to, I think the last question we'll have in this whole thing is, what might that say about Jesus' character, and what can we learn from that? I'm just going to leave it kind of at that. So there's a few questions in there as we kind of go through Luke and Luke 2 and this kind of this portion of it that takes us through, I believe, 39 to verse 52. It's right at the end of chapter 2. If you look into the show notes, we'll kind of re-put those questions there for you to look at that. We encourage you just to maybe reread chapter 2 again, but that portion, and just sort of look at those questions and maybe come up with some thoughts of how you might answer those questions.
And I think what we're trying to accomplish in here too is that it's important to read it on your own, but also to try and find someone to read it with and to discuss it. So in our church community, we do that on Sundays when we get together. We're encouraging our home groups to do that. But if you're just watching and you don't have that connection, try and find somebody that you can have a discussion with, because that does it'll bring out things that you may not have thought of in your own.
And try to, I know in this sort of stuff, when we ask these sort of questions, especially when you get into a group of people, we can get really maybe too stuck on the idea of right and wrong. And I'm not saying that there's not some right and wrong in this and all that, but what I would say, sometimes we might be surprised that it's not necessarily such a black and white answer to some of these things. There might be a lot of nuance. And somebody may say something and answer one of these questions with their thought. You might say, oh, that was really good, that must be right, and my thing must be wrong. And it might be like there's an aspect. But you might say, well, I saw it this way. And it might be like, oh, there's maybe more nuance to the answers. And I'm not saying that there's not maybe wrong answers in all this, but we might be surprised how sometimes the answer we have based on our understanding and perspective may be right, but still in a certain aspect of. And sometimes in that discussion, we might say there's more to these answers than we might be surprised by that.
And the way Jewish literature was meant to be processed was it's meant to be meditative. In that you don't just read it once and I got the answer, it's right and wrong. Like you said, it's meant to be read and reread and read together in groups and in communities and discussed to be able to get the full meaning and how you apply it in your context will change as context changes.
Well, truthfully, if you've maybe not read Luke lots or never read Luke before, the truth is you might have sort of a thought of an answer to some of these questions that in the coming weeks, as you read more about Jesus, you might go back like, oh, I might change that or augment that answer a little bit with more context. And I understand that's fine too. That's just how life works. But so thank you so much. We hope that you will take some time to just read chapter 2 of Luke for yourself. Take some time with these questions that will be in the show notes. Take some time to think about it. If you're a part of a small group, take some time just to discuss those things. And in discussion, please take time to listen to each other. I know it's really easy to interject your thoughts, or even especially if you disagree. Take more time to listen and make sure that you're understanding what people are time more than to correct. I'm not saying correction may not be a point there, but please take much more time to listen. Thank you for joining us. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.